Greetings and salutations. Thanks for checking out the video. I certainly do appreciate it. What I'd like to do in this video is basically just ramble on for a while about the concept of having a separate home partition in Linux. Now, I posted a poll Friday evening about this, and throughout the weekend I've had many comments and a lot of people have participated in the poll. This isn't scientific, this is just people who are in the community who took the time to talk about this a little bit. Thank you very much for all of your feedback. It is very cool. 44% of you said we don't need to bother with home partitions in this day and age. Don't worry about it. I'm assuming that you will just let the installer partition the drive as it wants to and then use the system happily. Another 17% said that they didn't know what a separate home partition was. So if you roll those into the 44% who didn't bother with it, you'll see that the vast majority of users out there don't care about this. And then of course there's 23% of you, they're hardcore Linux users and you always do this. Now I would have been in that category up until Friday, but now I'm starting to wonder whether I need to do this anymore. And then some of you, 16%, said that it depends on the system that you're working on. That's true for me too. There are some systems that I don't bother to put a home directory on. Now, if you're one of those who doesn't know what a home directory is, and you'd like to know, stick around. We're going to walk through the process of setting this up and explaining it. Now, the reason why I posted this poll was because on my new system, I wanted to reload the computer. And this should have been easy because I did go back and set up a separate home partition on this machine. When I first installed Linux Mint Debian on it, I had some trouble with the installer, and so I let it do it itself, just start over, and when it did, it created like an 8 GB swap space, which I'm not happy about. It was, no, I couldn't live with that. It's like, this machine has 32 GB of RAM in it, and for the way I use it, it's not going to use anywhere near 8 GB of swap, and it doesn't need it. So I reinstalled and repartitioned and put a separate home directory on there. And it was just this nightmare of the machine not wanting to install the operating system properly and not booting properly when I was done. It just would take me to the grub emergency prompt, and that was it. It was so frustrating. So let's talk a little bit about why you would do this in the first place. Before we get to that, let me say thank you to everybody who left comments about creating home partitions and talked about your individual setups. It was very cool. Gave me a lot to think about over the weekend before doing this video. Got a lot of comments on this poll. You guys are great out there in the community. You really jump up and participate in these things, and it is much appreciated. So anyway, let's jump in here real quick, and I want to get into one of my computers that I do have a very elaborate partitioning setup on. And I think the easiest way to show that would be to run gnome disks, right? Now this will take a little while to launch through the network, but you'll see it. This machine has 4 GB of memory on it, so in this case I wanted to have a swap partition that was slightly larger than the installed memory, which is the old school way of doing it. And if you're working on old machines, this can really help the performance. These days, especially in the Ubuntu family, when you install, it creates a swap file, little 2 GB swap file, which is absolutely fine. And by the way, when we talk about swap space and swap files, we're talking about an area that the machine can use when it starts running low on physical memory, or for some reason it wants to take something that it's hanging on to in memory and stick it on the hard drive for a little while. And yes, you do need to have some swap area, even if you have a machine that has a whole lot of memory in it, because the kernel needs that to do its job. So on this little machine, I've got a 256 gigabyte SSD, which I have created a home partition. This is the root partition. This is where your operating system lives. This is where all of the system's files are. Everything that is owned by the root user is here. It's another way to look at it. Then we have the 4 GB swap partition. This provides a place for the Linux kernel, the memory management, to take things out of memory and throw them on the hard drive for a little while. And because this machine only has 4 GB of physical RAM anyway, it will actually use this when, let's say, you have lots of web pages open and you're trying to do something that would tax this machine. And then finally, the rest of the space is devoted to /home. That is where it is mounted. This is stuff that is owned by the users. This is all of your personal files. Any file that you would create here as a user would be owned by you, and you would have full permission to do whatever you want with, regardless of whether you have an administrator level account or a standard user account. Everything that you do in your home directory is yours. So the idea of putting this in separate partitions, or you can call them loosely virtual drives, because that's how they're presented to the system. You can have one big hard drive, and then that hard drive can be divided up into logical drives, okay, or virtual drives. Virtual is not really right to say that. It's a logical drive is what it is, and the system sees that like separate block storage devices, but it's all on one device. Now, back in the early days of Linux, when storage was at a premium, it was not unusual to have a system that would have several different drives in it, because they were, number one, expensive, and number two, they were very often quite small. I mean, it was nothing to have a 40 or 80 megabyte drive in a personal computer back in 1991. So if you wanted to store some data, you'd have to get more drives and put it in there. Now, that quickly changed. By the mid-90s, we had machines that had 2 GB drives. If you had a lot of money, you could go out and get like big scuzzy 9 GB drives and things like that. And then by the end of the decade, the standard size was usually 10. And then it jumped to 40. And it's kind of just took off since then. Nowadays, when we set up a system, and if you've, I mean, just an average computer, I mean, it'll come with 500 gigabytes, a terabyte of storage on one block storage device. It's nothing for a system to have several terabytes these days. You know, 2 or 3, 4 gigabyte drives, and you've got over a petabyte available on just a regular system. So that begs the question, why are we doing this these days? We don't really need to separate things. Now, in this case, like I said, I wanted to have that separate swap space, and traditionally, I always set up that drive. There's another way to look at this, by the way. If we go in here, let me go ahead and close this. You know what I should have done? You know what I should have done, boys and girls? I should have started that. Let me show you a trick. If you launch something from a terminal, right, that's a graphic application, whether you're doing this on your own desktop or you're doing it through SSH using X forwarding, it doesn't matter how it works. If you will put that ampersand on the end, that will inform the system to throw that in the background. Now, that should pop up here in a few minutes. Well, because we got to wait for that to reload just like it did before. It takes a long time to load a graphic application through a network. But anyway, what I wanted to show you was, if we just do a clear the screen here on this, and make this terminal a little bigger and make it easier for people to see. Why don't you do that? Why is it doing that crazy crap? Let's do this. Oh, that's because you hit the wrong key. That's why. Yeah, okay. So if we do this, and we then do LSBLK, LS block. Notice down here at the bottom, because this is Ubuntu, we have all of these snap packages here that are in these little separate little virtual file systems, these loop file systems. But down here is the actual drives themselves. Now, you can stay back there. We're done with you, but I just wanted to show that we could have done that. In other words, I've got something running, but yet I'm working on the terminal at the same time. Isn't that cool? I like being able to throw this stuff in these videos. I hope it helps you, because it's little nerdy, geeky things like that that make me love working with Linux. Anyway, so you'll see that on this drive we have SDA, and that is mounted at root, and it's also mounted at run timeshift backup, and that's the timeshift utility that takes snapshots of the operating system so we can roll back if there's a problem. And then as you can see, we got 4 gigabytes of swap, and then SDA is home. So, or SDA3 is home. So, a couple of ways to express that. Now I hope you understand what a home directory is, or at least have some idea of how you set that up. So let's go ahead and exit this. And yes, I do have an opinion about whether or not I'm going to continue to do this. And I'll share that with you while we're working on this other thing here, because what I want to show you will actually take some time to do. Things get complicated when you start dealing with UEFI boot. And I guess that was mainly my problem that I was having with the computer trying to reload, is that for whatever reason, the Ubiquiti installer in Linux Mint 21.1 was just not having any of it. It wanted to create its own EFI partition, and that was it, right? What we're going to do is I'm going to install Linux Mint, and I'm going to show you the old school way of creating a separate home partition and how you should do it. However, in a virtual environment, which is what we're going to be working in here, a virtual machine, it doesn't necessarily like working with EFI. So I can't show you that part of it, and that was the part that gave me the problem. Okay, so here we are, and let's see if I should have... Yes, I do. Okay, so I can rescale this correctly. No, it's not running in the background. Okay, never mind. We have to deal with this. So let us put this in scaled mode. It'll make it easier to see. Well, it got smaller, but I can scale it. So here we go. Used to be that Linux Mint had the VirtualBox Guest Editions video drivers running when you would boot into it, but it doesn't seem to do that anymore. Or maybe it does and it doesn't work with my version of VirtualBox. So we're just going to have to deal with this, and this will be fine. We can see the installer. I'm going to make the fonts a little bigger. There we go. I think everybody can see that. So as I was saying, when we talk about EFI, what UEFI needs is a separate little partition at the beginning of the drive that holds a key in it that allows the system to boot so it won't boot off of anything else. That's the way I understand it. I could have that wrong. And setting that up is actually not that big of a deal. You just go into the installer and you create this little partition and you tell it this is going to be EFI, and everybody's happy. But the problem is that the installers themselves sometimes get very confused, and that's what happened to me. What I was trying to do, and I'll tell you about that in a minute because we're coming up on the part that I want to show you, but once we get this rolling and installing, I'll dive into the details of what happened to me on Friday, because I really would like to have your feedback on that too. So when you install Linux Mint on a computer, and we're assuming that you are going to start over, that you have a blank hard drive in it at this point, or you don't care about what's on the hard drive, you want to just get rid of everything. We're not talking about setting up a dual boot here. We're talking about something relatively simple. You can have the system do it automatically. It'll erase the hard drive, it'll create the partition table, and it'll put a proper partition in there. These days it just creates one big ext4 partition, and that's it. Or you can manually do this, all right? And here's where you can set up a separate home partition. So you see we're starting out with a completely empty drive. So the first thing that you would do would be create a new partition table. Right? And they say that you can undo it later if you want to. Anyway, we're going to continue. And it has automatically created a new partition table. It doesn't tell me what kind of partition table it is. It just says there's free space here. So I don't know what kind of partition table I just created. Did I create an MS-DOS compatible old school? Probably most likely. Or did I create a new partition table like the GID, which is a little bit different and works with EFI. Now let's see what we get here. So we would click on the free space and we would want to add a partition. And what we're going to do is add our home partition here. Now we don't want to use the whole thing. I've got 100 gigabytes set aside for this hard drive for this virtual machine. We're not going to use all of that. Now here's the first hurdle you have to figure out. The first thing you've got to know what to do. How big do you want your home partition to be? How much stuff are you going to install on this machine? If it's a very basic install and you're not going to be doing a whole lot with it, then you could probably get away with a relatively small partition. Back in the old days, I used to make them 20 or 30 gigabytes, and that was plenty. Nowadays, I usually make them a little bigger. I make them 64 or maybe even 100, and the reason why is because I usually run Time Shift, which is a program that creates snapshots of the operating system. It's kind of a backup on the fly sort of thing. If your computer completely gets borked up, you can go back to a well-known snapshot or last good known snapshot. Did that make sense? Probably not. And then you can restore it. The word well didn't need to be in there at all, did it? No, it didn't. Anyway, so that takes up space. So these days I usually set aside like 80 gigabytes, but just for the purposes of demonstration here, because I know it'll work, we're going to add 20 gigabytes, which is 20 and 3 zeros. That's what that is. Okay. This is going to be a primary partition. You do not want to do logical partitions. That's very strange. I'm pretty sure we're using the old MS-DOS partition table here. Now, we want it at the beginning of the space. Now, why would you want to put something at the end of the space? Because an old school way of doing this is to set up a swap partition at the very end of a drive. There are some advantages to doing that, I would guess. Not really part of the video today, so we're not going to worry about it. We're going to do the beginning of the space. We will choose the ext4 file system, thank you very much, and then it asks for a mount point. Our mount point is going to be root. This is where the system will be. So we'll go ahead and create that. Okay, so that's our first, which leaves us with 87.3 gigabytes of space that we can use for the home partition. We're going to go ahead and do that. So we double click on that or right click and grab add. We want to use the rest of the space. That's fine. And no, we do not need to create a swap partition in this day and age when dealing with Ubuntu-based systems, because it creates its own swap file. We're going to go ahead and let it do it. Now, if this machine had low memory, which it does, you might want to create a swap space that's as big as the memory is. Matter of fact, let's go ahead and do that. Why not? Let's go ahead and do that right now. So I have about 4 gigabytes of memory in this machine, and then we have to remember that the video is going to suck a little of that up. So the actual usable memory will be smaller, so we should be able to get away with 4096 on a swap partition. So we'll go ahead and do that. And come down here and from this list, swap area. And that will automatically say swap area. So let's go ahead and create that. So we've created a swap partition. Well, at this point it says unknown, but it says swap over here. Okay, this we're going to turn into home. We're going to use the ext4 file system because ext4 rocks. It's the best and most reliable that I know of. Fight me. Go on. That's what the comments section is for. Tell me how I'm an idiot for loving ext4. It won't change my mind, I promise. Alright, so now we go and we should have everything set up now. So the system is going to create, as you can see here, a root partition That's where all of the system files are going to go, and it's going to be 19.999 megabytes. Well, 1,000, no. 20 gigabytes minus 1 megabyte. That's what that is. Okay, so we have that set up. There's our well, that doesn't yeah, okay, we're good. We're all good. Okay, looks good. The numbers didn't work out. We have 1 megabyte of uninstalled space at the end. So let's go ahead and keep going. We will install. Now, if here's one that confuses me sometimes, and I think it gets a lot of people. Where do you want to put the bootloader? Well, in this case, it's telling us that it just wants to put it on a device, which is fine, but it will also give you the option to put it on one of these partitions if you want to. And sometimes when you're doing EFI with an EFI partition and an NVMe drive, you need to tell it that. That's what you need to do. And so that's what I did on Friday, and then tried it the other way, and none of the ways I did it would boot. So yeah, go ahead and continue. And we're going to go ahead and continue here, and then I will, while this is running, just go. I'm good with it. Just go. Yeah, Eastern time zone is perfectly all right. I don't care what the machine is named. And I'm going to put in my super secret, super safe password. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and let this install. Now, while it's doing it, let me explain what happened. Thursday evening, I was playing around with some video files, and I had a situation where the machine was having a hard time playing them. I was getting artifacts on the screen like screen tearing, and it actually locked up a couple of times while I was working with these videos. So Friday afternoon, I thought, well, maybe I should jump from LMDE5, which is what I was running, Linux Mint Debian Edition 5, which is based on Debian Bullseye. And they're going to come out with a new one this summer because Debian's coming out with a new version. That particular version of Linux Mint is running on the 5.10 kernel, which is kind of long in the tooth at this point. It's been around for a little while, so I thought, well, maybe I'd get better performance on a later Ubuntu kernel. I have an AMD Ryzen system, and it's an AMD 5-3400 GPU. So I thought, well, let me jump over to the Ubuntu-based version of Linux Mint. That's what I had been running, except I've been running Linux Mint 20.03. And it shouldn't have been that big of a problem because I did have a separate partition for my home directory on this machine. When I originally talked about this machine, I had said that I was having a bit of a problem getting Debian installed, and I let Debian create its own partitions. Well, I didn't like that at all because Debian came up, created a nice EFI partition for boot, no problem, and then it created an 8 gigabyte swap space, and I didn't need that kind of space. There's just no way. It would never use it. There's 32 gigabytes of RAM in this machine, and there's no way that I'm ever going to max it. So just having a little swap file would have been fine. So I did. I reinstalled Debian, went back, created a nice root directory, and created a separate home partition. So we had 3 partitions on the drive, EFI to start, and we had the nice little root partition, and then we had home. And then when Debian got booted up, I created a swap file the same way that Ubuntu does, and that worked great. The only problem was, like I said, I was having these weird video driver issues, and for instance, one of the things I noticed, and you may have noticed this too, is that when I was, the last couple of videos I did from this new machine, I didn't have transparency. See that? I like to have my terminal just a bit transparent so I can see what's going on behind it. And then the menu here for Linux Mint, that's also supposed to be slightly transparent. And they weren't. So apparently there was some sort of issue going on with the video. I don't know what it is. Now, since I had my separate home partition, it should have been super easy, no problem whatsoever, to do this. It should have been something that took less than 30 minutes to do, because I would have reinstalled, erased the root partition to reinstall the new version of Linux Mint that I wanted to run, but the home partition would stay the same. So in the installer, I tell it, I said, okay, here's your EFI partition. Fine. I tell it, reinstall over top of this root partition. Fine. Then I tell it to mount the home directory in the proper place, but don't format it. In other words, that's how you do that. You just tell it, I'll show you here how we can reload this system as soon as it gets done. I will go back and reload it and show you how to keep your home directory. And that was exactly what I wanted to do. Well, it wouldn't let me. And it wouldn't let me no matter what I did. It didn't matter where I told it to put the bootloader, whether I put it on the drive itself or put it on the first partition with EFI. I probably reloaded the system 4 or 5 times. Trying different things each time to try and figure out what it was I was doing wrong. Finally, it got to the point where nothing worked. And I even tried to use the partition editor to start over, in like what I just showed you here in this installer. And it was just, no, I ain't doing it. It acted like it installed, and then I booted the system and nothing had changed. And now I thought to myself, I have somehow or another borked up this brand new M2 NVMe Samsung SSD drive. The drive's gone bad. I've done something to it. And so the last ditch effort to get the machine to run was for me to boot up, open up gparted, and then blow all of the partitions off the drive, completely erase it and start over. So I had a blank drive. And then I allowed Linux Mint, the installer, to just do its thing. I didn't choose manual partitioning. I just chose automatic. And what did I end up with? An EFI partition and one great big root partition that has all of my home directory and everything in it. And that's the way this machine is running. And I'm not going to mess with it. And the reason why is because I don't know what was going on. I don't know what I did wrong. I did not have any problem reloading Debian. Debian actually told me at some point exactly what to do and what flags to set and everything. So I figured, okay, this shouldn't be any different with the Ubuntu-based version of Linux Mint. But apparently the Ubiquity installer is quite stupid and couldn't figure out what it was doing. So yeah, that was really a whole lot of fun to have to go through that, especially on Friday, because Friday was a day for me that was like a Monday. There's a lot going on with my real job that day. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to let this thing finish its install. It seems to be taking its time. Hopefully it hasn't crashed. We've been unpacking LibreOffice for quite some time here. Let's make sure the VM is still working. My luck, I'm sitting here talking and... Nope, VM is running. Everything's fine. The installer seems to be working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the vid and we'll come back when it's ready to reboot. Okay, we're back and we're going to restart now. I'm going to see what happens here. So we have established that there are pros to having a separate home partition. Theoretically, it should make it very easy to reinstall the operating system if you have to, without losing any data on the local drive. Of course, you should be backing things up regardless. That should not be considered to be safe enough to just change things, because like what happened to me on Friday is proof of that fact. So we have, let's see what happens when we go into the main installation here. But the pros would be separating your own data away from the other stuff on the system, and let's see, easily reinstalling, theoretically at least, and that's about it. Sometimes you might want to stick your home directory on a completely different drive. I have one machine like that. It's got 2 SSDs in it. It's got a small 64 gigabyte SanDisk drive that's the root directory, and then I have a 500 gigabyte drive, also a SanDisk, that is the home directory. So in that case, it makes perfect sense to do that, simply because a 64 gigabyte drive is not enough for the entire system. Alright, so we are in our new Linux Mint here, and it seems to be running fine. So what I would like to do is just do something to create something that will prove that the data stays behind. So I'm going to touch a file in the home directory, and I'm just going to call it Joe. That's all I'm going to do. This one little file will represent all of my settings. So I want to power this machine off, and we're going to pretend that we've used it for a while, and then for whatever reason we would like to reinstall the operating system. Now this operating system could be a different version of Linux. It could be the same thing, you just need to reinstall for whatever reason. So let's go ahead and go in here real quick. We got to change one setting because I have to reattach to the storage the boot disk, or else it won't boot into it. So we want Linux Mint 21.1. So we're pretending that we're going to reload this machine because we want to. And now we're going to start. So what are the cons of having a separate home directory? And yes, there are cons. One would be allocating the space, because whatever space you have on the drive, now you have to divide it up, and those are hard barriers. So for instance, if you end up giving yourself too small a space for your home directory and you install a bunch of crap on the machine and suddenly you're running out of space just in that part of it, well, that can definitely be an issue, and it happens. Do you see those drivers kick in? They are running on here. Okay. Okay. I thought they weren't running before. Or maybe that's just, maybe it just resets itself to that size. I'm pretty sure that's what it's doing. It's not drivers running, but it's resetting itself. Okay, so I've told it that I want to reinstall. And probably want to go ahead and make those fonts big again for you guys. Let's go here. What do we have it on? 1.4? Yeah, that'll work. Okay. The other con that I have found out, because I have had this machine set up both ways now, is that it appears that having one big happy file system instead of having two is faster. It definitely is a bit more zippy on reads and writes. And it might be just because the Linux kernel has to decide where to go, you know. And there's the overhead of running a file system. It is a noticeable difference. I mean, not majorly, but something that I did know was going on when I had it switched over the other way. Alright, so now, since we have something installed, we get all kinds of lovely options here. The first would be to erase the disk and start over. And then the next thing they're going to offer to do is create a dual boot with whatever's on the system. Don't ever take this option. I don't like dual boots to begin with, and I have said that in videos in the past, and I always get blowback when I say this, because they're confusing. And unless you are one of those users who absolutely positively 100% understands exactly how bootloaders work, which I thought I was up until Friday, I would not recommend ever setting up a dual boot. Now, if you are one of those people and it's an experimental machine and you're willing to take the risks, be my guest. But the average user who is not really familiar with partitions and bootloaders and stuff like that, a dual boot can be a disaster waiting to happen. So we have all of these different options here. We're going to choose something else. We're going to go in here, and now it's going to show us how our drive is partitioned. And unfortunately, the way this is laying itself out, we just got this little squeaky little window here. Let's see if we can make that bigger. Let's see if it'll stretch out a little bit here if I do this. You want to let me do it? No. This is what we got. Okay. We'll deal. So, as you will recall, this is our root system. We do not have an EFI partition because this machine doesn't have one set up since it's virtual. We have our swap space, and then we have the home partition with all of our data in it, which is one file named Joe at this point. So if I want to reinstall this system and keep my data, this is how I would do it. So I want to change this partition. The default is do not use. I'm going to tell it that I do want to use it, and I want to put an ext4 file system on it. I want to format this partition. I want the partition to be mounted as root. Okay. And it says, and we will continue. Well, we understand that. So let's go here. We'll continue. We're done. Now, the next thing we want to do is to come here, and we don't have to worry about the swap partition. That'll figure it out. What we do here is come to the home partition, and don't change any of the size or any of that stuff. Make sure you don't mess with that. Tell it it's an ext4 partition, which is what we did before. Do not format the partition. Do not click that. Now, go to here and mount it at home. So what this is going to do is it's going to reinstall this system, and it's going to keep your home directory. So let's go ahead and move forward. And yeah, we can put the bootloader there. That's not a problem. Yep. Continue. Continue. Reeling with the feeling. Don't stop. Continue. Time zone. Yep. Now this next part is important. You can put your name in. Your username has to be the same as it was before. If it is not, or you do not create the users in the order in which they were originally created, in other words, you need to create your account first, that's the one you install, and then you have to create the other user accounts in the order that they were originally created, or the system will get confused. The system does not go by your username. It goes by your user number. So the user that I'm creating here is going to be 1000. That's the first user. And in the case of Ubuntu and Linux Mint systems and Debian, the first user that installs on a desktop system is usually the one who has administrator privileges. And then you will create other accounts. You need to keep, you need to know exactly how you did that. Or else you'll have to recreate all of those accounts and then manually move all the data back, because the system won't know where they are. Yeah, it's a little weirdness with Linux, so ask me how I know that. Found that out the hard way a long time ago. So we're going to go ahead and let this system reinstall. We're going to reboot it, and we're going to see whether it kept our home directory or not. So you stay there. It'll be just a blip for you, but probably be about 10 minutes for me. I was sitting here watching this install, and the thing that takes the longest for it to do is configure LibreOffice. Remember how before I thought the VM might have locked up? No, it just takes that long. Okay, so we're going to reboot now. Our second reboot. And when I press enter, it should get rid of the ISO file that is in the virtual optical drive. We should be booting back into the system as we had it before. So a couple of things should happen here. First of all, our fonts should be just as big as they were before, because you'll remember I made them larger. Did I? We'll see. Yeah, I think I did it, and it's going to stick. Yep. All right. So that's one thing. So let's open up a terminal on this and see if our little file we created is there. So all I got to do is, yep. So you know that all of the settings and everything were saved. So what do you have right now? Well, you have a system that has all of your personal files, all of your settings, your emails, everything with your web browser, like your saved passwords and keys and whatnot, everything is already here. However, what might not be here is stuff that you have added to the system since you've done this reinstall, which means you'll have to go back and put your programs back in. Now, that's going to be a bit of a pain for some people because they don't remember what they installed. You can write a script to do this, which is a very common practice, which means that when you reinstall, you run this script and it automatically goes out and gets and configures all the software and it puts it in the system and boom, you're done. I have done that in the past, but recently I don't do this very often anymore. I don't reinstall as much because I haven't been doing as much playing with Linux this way, and plus my philosophy has changed quite a bit. It used to be that whenever I would change my distribution or want to do an upgrade, I thought, well, the best way to do it is nuke and pave. We're going to start over, you know. And I've kind of gone to this other idea now of no, upgrade in place, maintain things as they go along. Linux is very good at not creating a whole bunch of garbage that sits on the drive. Some people go on and on about that and go, oh, I have this big cache here and I have that there. They're supposed to be there. Caches make things go faster. And the system does a pretty good job of managing itself. So I don't leave it, I don't mess with it. As a matter of fact, when I created the BU backup utility, that is designed to get everything, the caches, everything out of your home directory, create a backup of it, and put it back. And we'll talk about that more here in just a moment. So let's look at one thing here before we say goodbye to this subject, and that is how Linux figures out where things are at boot time. When Linux boots up, it references a file in the system called fstab, which is the file system table. That's what fstab is short for. The letter F, S, and tab. It's not fstab. Okay? fstab, file system table. And any user can take a look at the file system table, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And we'll do it on our virtual machine here, because it should be quite interesting. So if we go in here and we say, I'm trying to figure out what tool to use to do this. Let's do cat. It's the simplest way to do it. And it is in the etc directory. And the file is simply called fstab. And if we view that file, we'll get something that looks a bit like this. So let me go ahead. Oh, would you quit doing that? Do this. I keep hitting the wrong key, and I've done it 2 or 3 times now. There we go. Now I can make that bigger. Okay. So this is the file system table. The first thing that you will see is that we're using a UUID, which is a universal device ID. That's for block storage devices in Linux systems. So if we move this around, like we plug it into another plug on the SATA port or something like that, the system will still be able to find it by this ID that's on the partition. We're mounting it at root. We're using the EXT. I used EXT2 by accident. Wow, that's cool. We're booting off of EXT2. That's cool. Now, I should have done EXT4. I didn't see that. I was talking and clicked on the wrong thing. So we have the home directory here, which is EXT4 as it should be. By the way, don't boot your system off of EXT2. Even though the installer will allow you to do it, it's not a good idea. I'm glad this is just a test machine because I would have to erase that. EXT2 has no file journaling. It is the oldest EXT file system for Linux, and it's not that it's unstable, it's a little bit vulnerable. It's not bad for USB sticks if you don't want the overhead of a file journal and all that stuff. But anyway, we're getting off into something else. And finally, it's the swap space. So what is here is how it's done. So you can, let's say that you have a small drive in a computer and you want to put another drive in it. You can move all of the stuff from your local home directory over there and then tell the system where it is. There are tutorials online about how to do this. I've done a couple of videos on it myself. So that's another thing that you can do. Or you can be like me, and I think I'm just going to stop bothering with this as much as I have in the past. Like I said, these days I sort of upgrade in place a lot. And I really just don't see the need to have all this. You keep backups. If the UEFI is going to be this much of a problem, and it's not going to make swapping things out easy, why bother with it? Which is the experience that I just recently had. Now, I'm sure that you will have things to say in the comments about this, and I would love to hear from you. You can put them down there. Your feedback is always welcome. I hope this video did you some good, and I hope it makes you go out and look for more information about home partitions and file systems and setting up Linux and all that other stuff, because that's part of what I like to do in these videos, is to not give you the whole loaf of bread, but a few slices, and hopefully you'll go out and find this out for yourself, because Linux isn't a tool and it isn't a product. It's a journey. And once you start down that road, it's a journey of learning and discovering and rediscovering. So that's what I have found over the last 15 years, and I hope it works that way for you too. Thanks for watching, gang. We'll talk again soon.